we've got, we'll stop this at 4:30 or sooner if there isn't a need to discuss further, but we would be interested in your reactions, questions, comments, and to get some feedback on this. Annika, okay, Annika, and okay, Diana first, ladies first. Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, first of all, for that presentation. Very lucid and very, very interesting. I have two questions. One of the challenges with visions and working back, sort of operationalizing visions, is imbalance. What I mean by imbalance is essentially, in this context, sort of the differential or the different pace of the rates of take-up. So I wonder how your report or the work that you're doing contends with that. So you've got your 45 companies, they're some of the largest companies in the world, and they clearly buy into this vision of sustainability and so forth. But then you've got a whole multitude and plethora of sort of other actors which basically don't really fall under the same sort of remit, may not have the same capacity to undertake the same kinds of things, or at least not at the same pace, even though they might buy into the logic of it. So that happens across companies, but also across countries. Similarly, like you come from the Netherlands, and there's a more sort of progressive view there, but you moved from China back, so clearly there's a bit of a differential pace of take-up taking place there. Clearly, the Chinese recognize their issues with pollution and so forth as well, but it's just that much harder to move everything in the same pace. So that's one question. How do you deal with this? The other question I have is, how do we know that this vision that we're calling, or I mean, I'm just using your report as an example, how do we know this vision is really sustainable? This, I think, it's sparked by the kind of anecdote that you mentioned yourself about Puma, or you could take other analogies. When we move to different ways of doing things to basically counteract some types of negative externalities, we move to other ways where we aren't really predicting what the new negative externalities might be. So here we had a lot of discussion about moving from coal-fired to natural gas-fired energy sources, just to take an example. So great, we're doing a lot for the environment by moving to a better source, low energy intensity and so forth, but then we've got the fracking issues and the other issues that go along with it. So is it really a question of a sustainable vision, or which is really sustainable, or is it a question of these are the visible externalities that we see, and we really can't predict beyond a certain point what the other types of negative externalities might be? So how does your thinking kind of reflect on that? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, good. Let me give you... You didn't introduce yourself. Aniket Bhushan is from the North-South Institute, so I'll introduce you, Aniket, just so you know. What about you?
Yeah, let me give you a philosophical answer. My personal view is that the complexity that we've created with humans, population growing and a lot more people kind of entering into, well, the global economy, global debate, is that, and production, is that we've created a complexity that none of us can individually, but even in small groups, can no longer deal with. And when you deal with very, very complex situations, you are better off kind of always, and you see that in large companies as well, the ones that have very clear missions, the ones that have very clear missions, very clear values, rather than have super, super detailed process, are the ones that do far better. And because that allows for a certain amount of freedom, experimentation at the ground level, rather than have a really, really centralized model. And that, I think, helps when you also have a vision together. It would be super useful if the nations in the United Nations were to spend a little bit of time together and saying, what are we actually trying to achieve here together? I think that that's gone completely missing out of the debate about, well, it's this and that, it's a technological debate, but what is missing is a vision for where do we want to end up, and then try and find what are the commonalities, what can you contribute to that overall vision, and what can you not? Because I think what China wants to achieve is vastly different today from what Europe wants to achieve or what the United States wants to achieve. That kind of leads also to your second question, is how do we know it's the right thing? Well, we don't. We know that we will get it wrong along the way. I mean, for some time, people thought that storing carbon in the oceans was a great idea. Now we've discovered it's probably the worst idea anyone could have ever come up with. Because ocean acidification is so rapid and is potentially leading to the loss of entire life in the oceans. But that should not, and therefore actually to have a vision and to all kind of work towards the vision and allow for a certain amount of experimentation within boundaries. I'm the last person to say that we should have all this bioengineering and or geoengineering, that we should just go off and try this and try that. I mean, of course, that needs to be in a controlled way, but there is no one single answer. For instance, on our energy, on a clean energy future, we don't really know what technology will make it in the end. But I think we know that the way we're going today, by not doing anything, we're certainly going over the cliff. And so we do have a need to, at least in a collaborative way, try various things, maybe try things on small scale first, and before we then collectively scale things up.
Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Carney. I'm from Canada 2020, which is a think tank here in Canada. The vision that you've presented is to me very optimistic, and it's a fundamental change being led by companies, which makes it all the more interesting for that. I'm just wondering, what the role of your organization is and the role of the companies themselves in transforming that, persuading other companies, I guess. And you did sort of hint that some of it might be a bit of first mover advantage for some of the companies, but persuading their less enlightened peer companies, persuading governments also, and I think persuading people that we can have an economy, and I take your point that we don't know that it's going to work out, but that this might be possible in a way that might provide us with, in a way, a better life. You presented a more kind of holistic view of what we could be thinking about, and one anecdote. We recently held an event on carbon pricing here in Canada, which you may know is way down our government's agenda. And we had a representative from industry, a reasonably enlightened ex-industry from the oil industry. And he was affirming how seriously they took this issue and how, yes, we are ready and we do know and we do understand. And we know that they are using shadow prices, etc. And then he was asked by a member in the by an audience member, why don't you go out and advertise to the public that you think that this is the best thing that should happen? You advertise that, we can all swim in the tailings ponds and it's all delightful, really. They put these nice pictures up, but actually they don't tell people that they can accommodate this. And so people fundamentally, I think, disbelieve that it's possible that their lifestyle will be anything, comparable to what it is today in a future that is shaken up in the way you talk about it. So I guess there's a number of leadership things that I would wonder how you think are going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's at the heart of the debate that happens inside our organization. For years, our organization was really a think tank where a lot of conversation happened and was very much, say, member-led, member-driven. And so kind of the way it moved forward was, I won't say the lowest common denominator, but was certainly not the most progressive end of the spectrum. When Peter Bakker took over as president, that was because the board, 8 CEOs together, said, you know what, after Copenhagen particularly, we do really have to now take a much more of a leading role. And so they appointed Peter, who was one of the most progressive CEOs himself, and said, well, you're now going to lead this organization and you're going to do this little bit of pushing and shoving with your own members. And so Peter's been in the role a year and a half now, and I must say, there is an enormous lone mover disadvantage So there's not that much in sustainability. There's not as much of a first mover advantage. For a few companies, there maybe is, who can kind of turn their brand into something where people say, oh, okay, well, that's the... I mean, but there's only space for a few Patagonias in the world. The competitor to Patagonia will find it very, very difficult to take that same marketing platform, for instance. And Puma finds it very difficult to turn what I think is quite visionary leadership, to turn that into consumer advantage. Doesn't really work. Toyota has struggled for 20 years to get their Prius to sell really well. And why is it ultimately sold well is mostly in the countries that have given tax incentives to do so. And so there's a big lone mover disadvantage. Paul Polman came out with, when he became CEO of Unilever, and said, I'm now going to get this company on a track to a sustainable future without even knowing how he would get there, the targets that he set for himself. And basically it's led to people thinking, well, I'm not going to move with him. I'm just going to see how he does. And that's really kind of scary. And so that's what we're trying to pull companies with us together and say, well, if we went collectively, so for instance, 29 CEOs writing this document, their individual signatures, I mean, it's more powerful, but for them also is lower risk because they're part of a group, of a larger group. And that's what we're trying to achieve now also, for instance, with the energy companies to say, guys, there is a way for a CO2 tax. There is a way that can work, and you know it, and you have done all the modeling, and it will actually not be that bad for you as a company, particularly if you take CCS into your mix, because it's the oil companies are probably going to develop the technology to implement CCS, and they'll turn it into a revenue opportunity. It's just a matter of going out and saying, yeah, we're ready for it. And so that's kind of where we're trying to get now, is to move the companies even further and further into the progressive end of the spectrum. And by me going around telling the world that they're ready kind of helps push them also. Okay, Bruce.
Okay, yes. I like very much what you're saying, and I think when we ask questions. Sorry, I was going to say I like very much what you're saying. Among many things, the idea of shifting from labor-based to natural resource-based tax systems. That being said, at times like this, of course, we want to bring the questions where we find there could be some rough edges. So let me cite two things where I think they're rough edges that, if addressed, would, for a person like myself, help to build trust, because actions speak louder than words. So what's going to happen between 2020 is more important to me than a vision in 2050. Let me cite two things that would cause me to be concerned. We're talking about impact, and we're talking about inclusive growth. So I'd like to see at some point how, or I need to research to find how you are really helping the poor get access to value chains, because inclusive growth means, to my definition, pro-poor growth, because those are the people that today are excluded. And so when I look at it through that lens, and then when I look at sustainability, in the end, sustainable communities and sustainable economies require good public regulation, the role of the public sector, an active private sector that generates wealth, and a not-for-profit sector that often does things that otherwise wouldn't be done by the other two sectors, and often identifies areas that should be public goods. And therefore, let me cite two. I look at the reference to food and biofuels. Well, there's a great contradiction today, and therefore I wonder how your organization would look at the two examples I would give. In the last 10 years, there's been 103 million hectares of land acquired by Europeans and North Americans in Africa, not for food. It's taken land out of food production. 60% of it, the data is very clear. The evidence has been collected by the former organization I used to direct, the International Land Coalition, and that means the European Union, the World Bank, and the social movements, a hybrid. They find 60% of that land is being used to produce biofuels at the expense of building the assets of rural people who are being displaced from their land, and it's those assets that allow them to grow out of poverty. So when we see those actions, we believe very much in the importance of dealing with fragile natural resources. We know that feeding the current population and the future population of the world means growing more food on land that's currently available. There's not a lot of other land to bring into cultivation. So when I see somebody trying to blend biofuel targets, and of the biofuels, it's not the Japanese and the Chinese and the Indians that are buying this land. This land is being bought by Europeans and North Americans using agriculture subsidies as the way into the biofuel targets. So there's a conflict there between what you're trying to do. And this, again, as I say, is not a contradiction, a questioning of many of the good things, but that's an example. The other is that our government recently, I've recently read the report on inclusive growth that was presented to our Department of Foreign Affairs. In that report, they talk about many things related to inclusive growth. And they identify that there is a thought in the public at large and in many organizations that from the point of view of governments in developing countries having the income to sustain the provision of public goods, that a lot of the loss is due to corruption that involves often foreign transactions. But the data is that that's not really the case. 60% of the revenue that's being diverted is in transfer pricing. And therefore, when we look at the good intentions of these companies, we also have to ask the question, good, but within what margins? To what extent? They may be legally entitled to transfer their pricing the way they are under the regulations as they exist. But if you're really concerned about sustainability, to what extent are you looking at how to play a role in helping to shape the public policies that govern the ability to do things like transfer pricing? At a very important meeting hosted by the North-South Institute last week with international officials, someone went so far as to say one of the most effective ways to practice corporate social responsibility would be to move away from transfer pricing. So these are the kinds of questions by which, not so much to intend to poke holes in, but to understand how you're trying to address. These are two examples of very practical situations that cause people to be skeptical about what you've presented.
I'm absolutely fine if people are skeptical, because I mean there's one thing to have good intentions and to have an interesting vision, but indeed, I mean, we first need to all prove that we can actually achieve something or achieve a lot, hopefully, ultimately. Let me say where the way we currently approach it is that we work with our companies and try to really come up with an agenda for the next 7 years. And we've actually first gone to the science community and say, help us understand what the real top 4 or 5 priorities are from, say, an environmental, natural capital point of view, and what you think companies can or have to do to contribute to getting the world on track. And similarly, on the social capital side, what are the things that are the real priorities from a social point of view? We're currently, I mean, these days, really working on getting that. And like next week, I have a conference call with 50 of our companies to say, this is the 9 priorities, a set of 9 priorities that have come out of that. 4 on a natural capital side, 4 on a social capital side, and 1 fresh water that is kind of a little bit in the middle. If you see those things on the social side, for instance, poverty reduction or eradication is one of them. And you're entirely right that there are contradictions in there. You cannot say, okay, well, we are going to, for instance, feed the whole world, clean up our act in agriculture, reduce nitrogen, phosphor cycles, and still say make sure we provide food for the entire world without reducing biodiversity anywhere in the world, without looking at this like, geez, that's pretty hard, because that's not the way we're designed today. The way we're designed is exactly as you describe it. Okay, well, so let's do biofuels. Okay, well, where do we find the land to actually go and do that? Because I can't change my cornfield into a biofuel field, so let's go into Africa. And that's exactly the debate that we ought to be having, and hopefully will lead to decisions by companies, particularly because they become more transparent in what they do and can therefore be held more accountable for what they're doing. on the transfer pricing thing, I would say it's the exact same thing. The more transparent we are, the more the public understands the complexities and how it plays out. I think Starbucks in the UK was a very good example of something that was perfectly legitimate. And but the UK, I don't know if you're aware of that, the UK really went after Starbucks because they said, these people pay no tax in this country. So we go and we pay quite a few pounds every day for our coffee, and we like it. But these people contribute almost nothing to our tax income, and they're really challenging Starbucks to change their ways. And I think it's absolutely the right thing. And I think companies will soon have to come out with, we are actually going to make, from an ethical point of view, but it is ultimately a trust of the public, a trust of the consumer, because the consumer turns against, particularly the consumer brand, they have a real problem. It is far more difficult for a consumer to turn against a B2B brand that is less well known, that is less transparent. But I think, and I certainly, I mean, I was in business and I've dealt with Chinese government that make exactly the same statement to me, that I wasn't paying enough local taxes, and the next month you win a prize for being the best taxpayer in the district, which kind of make me wonder what everybody else is paying in transfer prizes. But it is a serious problem of how much do you contribute to the communities in which you operate. And that's exactly what we want to get on the agenda with these companies, and try to create accountability, transparency, and much more open debate with society. Because it's not one solution, but it's a set of solutions that need to be, I think, driven from, this is the vision that we have, these are the values that we're going to uphold. Ultimately, it's an ethical conversation. What does business contribute to society? What's business' role to society? It's not just creating money. It's far deeper than that.
Okay, David, try to keep your questions to one, if you would, because I've got a number of people who'd like to speak.
Could I call it one two-part question?
Two-part, but keep it short.
One A and one B.
Yeah. Dave Fraser, working in extractives and sustainable development, helping companies and NGOs. And my particular expertise is business development and marketing. So I'd be happy to be an ambassador for this vision. First, but nothing sells like inevitability. And if you're looking for people around the table here to help engage with business in Canada, it's a lot easier to sell a vision or get people to accept an idea if we can also say, well, it's going to happen anyway. So I was particularly intrigued by your comment that this is going to happen in 5 to 10 years. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And in particular, how do you get the governments to agree on the price of the externalities? Because it seems to me that's the key part of this. So why is it inevitable? And how exactly do governments agree on the externalities and the price of those externalities?
It's too much to say that it is inevitable. I mean, history has proven that good ideas don't always make it to become reality. But I do think that, say, in the past couple of years, the shift has come because there are examples, and there are kind of the dinosaurs of the old view of capitalism are starting to really turn the corner. As introduced, I worked for McKinsey for a number of years. I was as a McKinsey alum, you get invited for webinars and seminars, etc. And I was recently invited for a webinar. It was an hour-and-a-half conversation with the alumni across the world, led by Dominic Barton, the managing director for McKinsey Worldwide, and it was about the future of capitalism. And it was exactly this conversation on how we're going to reframe growth, how are we going to price into externalities. It was exactly that conversation. You see happening in, I mean, if you have the debate at Bloomberg and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and in BlackRock, I'm starting to get more and more comfortable that people are taking this really seriously and that people are working towards solutions. GRI, SASB, the accounting boards that kind of set the rules ultimately are pretty advanced in their modeling. There's the IRRC that is kind of bringing all of that together into a new set of accounting standards. And I think governments will follow and will that once they get presented with an image of this is how it can work and this is how it will work. But we're certainly interested in working with a few governments that say, well, we're willing to be the people stick out our necks and we'll be willing to try. And some governments around the world see that really as their as kind of their way in which they can differentiate themselves. So if you go to South Korea, you get a very, very receptive ear. South Korea is very, very poor. It's mostly, I mean, it serves product development, but very, very low on natural resources. South Korea very, very keen to work with us on this and others. I mean, it's not WBCSD alone. I mean, we're just one of the voices in this debate. Denmark, same thing. I mean, Denmark has an enormous track record of having healthy economic growth, also in traditional standards, while in absolute terms reducing their emissions. So the Danish government are very, very keen to work with us on this. I see movement in Germany and in Mexico, South Africa, particularly in countries like Mexico, South Africa, where that balance of social and natural capital is a far more optimistic one. And then you see governments that are really in trouble and need to do something. So, say a Portuguese government with huge unemployment issues is very receptive to say, well, come tell us a new way forward, and then we'll find a way. So it's going to come from hopefully enough technological and comfort that this can work, and then a number of people just have to say, okay, well, we're going to try and test, and we're going to show that it's possible. Yes, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. John Dillon with the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. Just for those of you who may not know, the CCCE represents 150 of the largest companies in Canada. I want to address what I think is a bit of a subtext that I heard through some of the comments this morning, and that is that maybe Canadian companies are behind the curve when it comes to sustainability. To do that, though, I think I have to, if you'll permit me, Mr. Chairman, a bit of a history lesson. I've been with the Council for 23 years. One of my first jobs was to work on something that was called the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and the preparation for it. And in doing that, we worked closely with an organization called the Business Council for Sustainable Development, which of course was the predecessor to the WBCSD. Maurice Strong, a Canadian, who was the Secretary General of the Earth Summit, one of the people he talked to was my former boss, Tom DeQuino, about how to engage business in sustainable development. And I think Maurice probably takes credit for, along with Stefan Schmidt-Heine, with creating the BCSD at that time. To my recollection, there were 6 Canadian companies who were part of that original BCSD. TransAlta, Noranda, Alcan, Nortel, Ontario Power Generation, or Ontario Hydro as it was known, and Suncor. And you'll note that 3 of those companies no longer exist. One rather unfortunate story, and 2 companies that have since merged or changed or been purchased by international conglomerates. And Canadians were very active in those early days of sustainable development. The first president of the BCSD was Hugh Faulkner, a Canadian. And our companies were very active in WBCSD and in other work that went on during that time. It was interesting to us because as the council, it was really a time when CEOs started to get it as far as environment and sustainability was concerned. And it was a very transformational time. Interestingly, a lot of that is spread through a number of initiatives. You're probably familiar with the Responsible Care Initiative chemical industry that's now global, but it was started here in Canada. Companies like 3M picked up some of their ideas from the Canadian program. Our Canadian companies, there was a time when I would dare say in the late 1990s when our Canadian companies were doing more in carbon trading than virtually any other country in the world. A lot of things have happened since then. One of them is that we haven't had policy in this country and we've had a great debate about policy, and we don't need to deal with that today. But one of the things that is interesting is that first report, Changing Course, by the then BCSD. The major recommendation and the major focus of that was on pricing externalities. In fact, the mantra in those days was full cost pricing. That's 20 years ago. So what's happened? Well, it's proven to be a lot more difficult than people thought. And it's interesting that we're still debating it. It wasn't like every company in Canada or elsewhere in the world embraced the idea that, all we have to do is price externalities. And we'll figure out the answer to these questions. But I think it's fair to say that a number of Canadian companies were leaders in those days and leaders today in thinking about how you do that, including taking public positions on carbon pricing today, which my organization did 6 years ago. But it's proven to be, and sustainability in and of itself is a concept that a lot of companies embrace. But I think a lot of them still have challenges explaining to their customers, to their suppliers, and the Canadian public what sustainability and sustainable development actually means in practical terms. And that's part of why we still have this debate. But I think, I did want to address this issue of the Canadian role and the Canadian corporate response in this because it's important we put it in that context. I think it's regrettable that there's only one Canadian company, as far as I'm aware, Suncor, that's still involved in WBCSD. I think there's a role for more involvement, but there's also many other venues, as you would know, through which these issues get discussed, through international sectoral associations, through other initiatives, the UN Global Compact. In fact, when I talk to Canadian companies, one of their complaints is there's too many of these things. There's too many people trying to tell us we need to sign up to this initiative or that initiative on sustainability. Yeah. It's not so much that they don't appreciate it or they don't get it. They're trying to figure out where their priorities and where their involvement should lie. So, thank you.
John, if I can just pick up on what you said, I was in China in late November, early December. I had lunch with Morris from his office, and he talked to me about this, about these initiatives that he was involved in 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And he was asking the same question, what's happened since? Interesting to hear you say exactly what he was telling me in Beijing in November. But you want to react?
Well, I just want to react to one point, is that in 64 countries around the world, WBCSD has an affiliated national network of companies. And we had one in Canada, and we have it varies. In some countries it's very, very active. The Brazil Business Council Sustainable Development, very, very active. I think they have 15 people on their staff. They have like 70 companies that are members, and that interaction works really well. And I think with Canada, and it's particularly actually with CCC, that I think we need to try to have that conversation and say, well, how do we engage with the business networks that do exist in this country? Because I'd say, I think this is one of the countries where we can look back and say, well, it's been around for 20 years and it hasn't worked. But today, I think it's just not good enough to go and say, well, okay, well that's then just the case, and let's go back to there is a time now that I think businesses are willing to take a lot more responsibility on their own shoulders. And that is just, and so maybe it is here in Canada as well, but in the rest of the world we just don't hear much about that. And I think the global debate will be helped if we heard a lot more about that. And we'd be the first ones to spread those good stories, because that helps our cause. And that's all I would say about that.
My point was not that it's not working. In fact, that there's a great deal happening. It's just that it's not necessarily through the vehicles that some people want to point to.
I mean, to be fair, I've only joined the Canadian Council of Chief Executives 3 months ago, having worked in global consultancies, the public service, and now here in Ottawa. I think John's being, frankly, a bit too modest about his work, if you'll allow me, John. But I mean, our organization came out 6 years ago with a very clear policy to put a price on carbon. We continue to advocate that issue publicly. I think Diana's group has been carrying forward that dialogue, more recently in the Canadian public. We have some firms in the extractive sector that have frankly set the standard for operations, and we have others that are laggards. We have the chemicals industry, sustainable, responsible care brand. It's actually now become a brand, is now a global brand in the chemical sector, and one of its hallmarks is community engagement. Constant dedication to community engagement, safety, putting a price on their activities. So I think we have a bit of a Canadian brand problem. This is one of many, if you will, where we just are a little bit too quiet, frankly, about some of our work. But I think you made an excellent point about maybe the need for a national affiliate here in Canada. We'd be happy to carry on that conversation.
Yeah, because I don't think I think you have a fabulous brand. Absolute fabulous brand. I mean, if there's one country in the world that has the reputation for being environmentally responsible, it's probably Canada. I mean, there's a reason that everybody in the world carries around Canadian flags on their backpacks.
Not so much anymore.
But that is, you are far more aware yourself.
We just say one thing: the government is not Canada.
No,
the federal government is not Canada.
You have a lot more kind of what the recent developments in Canada are largely the rest of the world is ignorant about that. You can still carry forward. No, your brand is fabulous, and indeed, I mean, don't be modest about it. I mean, engage in the conversation, tell everybody what you've achieved and what you want to do with others, and it's an open invitation to collaborate.
Okay, Mark.
Yes, I did. Thank you. Mark Freed. I'm head of policy for Oxfam in Canada. Well, there's wonderful things you said, and I want to pick up on some of the other points that have been made. I'm really intrigued by the social capital part. I mean, we try to integrate at Oxfam also environment and poverty issues together, and kind of look at it as there's in our work there has to be an environmental ceiling on all economic activity, and at the same time a social floor, so that people shouldn't be living in extreme deprivation. And we have to find a way to bring those together, which is what you're trying to do in talking about different forms of capital. I think that's really positive. I also I'd like to hear more about how you're incorporating the social capital issue and how you're grappling with that. Does it mean simply corporate social responsibility projects where there are particular, a company may build housing in the place where it's operating, as the Canadian government is now funding companies to do, that sort of thing, or is it, as you seem to imply, that the companies want to take their responsibility beyond simply acting as an individual company and beyond acting collectively as companies, but actually engage with government and respecting the government and the public. There are public solutions needed and public structures needed in order to address the poverty and environmental devastation that we need. That there's a proper role for government in this, and that it's part of business's responsibility to support that role and to ensure that government functions properly, which gets back to the question that Bruce is raising about paying your fair share of taxes, right? So the government actually can provide the services that are needed so people can work their way out of poverty.
Well, we've reached out to Oxfam and worked with Kate. Her last name escapes me. Yes, Kate Hayworth, who's made that very, very interesting model of the donut. It was an excellent publication where it's basically this planetary boundary framework of the nine priorities areas from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and then Oxfam came out and said, well, this is where the tensions then are on the social priorities, because so we're actually in conversations with Kate on how we can further that, and maybe come up with a kind of a combined view on how these things, because sometimes they interact, sometimes they contradict, sometimes there needs to be found a balance. And I've been, and I'm also completely new to this, well, I've been kind of struck by the fact that the awareness and the research and is really, I mean, sustainability is 90% an environmental, has been an environmental conversation as far as I can see, and only 10% is social. And particularly in WBCSD, if you look at all our work, it's about 90% it's work done in the natural capital side, and 10% only in the social capital side. And the push to put the social capital far more to the forefront and to really understand how these things work come very interestingly from the Indian companies, the South African companies, the Brazilian companies. Not that it's so interesting that it comes from them, because that's pretty logical, but they get traction because it's the Spanish CEOs and the Portuguese CEOs and the Italian CEOs and the French CEOs that say like, oh, now I get it. Yeah, there is really a tension, and we need to address that. To your second point, for me, the days of CSR is kind of like the base you have to do, but the days of, okay, well, let's take a little bit of our profit and go put a few water holes in the ground somewhere and send a few people across the world and do a bit of fighting hunger, etc. Those days are really over. It's about applying your fundamental skills and taking your fundamental responsibility for the communities in which you operate, and sometimes which you don't operate. I know for a fact that Unilever has gone to the governments of Spain and to the governments of Greece and Portugal and say, you have such a challenge with youth unemployment. Can we not develop projects together where we take some of the agricultural business that we have somewhere in the world and try to, for instance, put that in your country and develop a scheme together where we get young people to work in all the farms or things like that. And I know for that the Greek government has been particularly receptive to that idea, and that is one of the projects that's currently on the way. And so I see, and that's an individual company taking, I think, a lot of responsibility, but at least that is then really part of their value chain. It's no longer, well, let's do something good for a troubled area. Because it's good for Unilever as well. They probably get access to a good product at a reasonable rate.
Dan Rubenstein, President Scales of Governance, and worked to help set up the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, and worked there some years. First, I'm also an associate of the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Winnipeg. First, just a correction. In your timeline, the most critical element in the history of sustainable development you've missed, and that is the promulgation of our common future in 1979. And there's a wonderful Canadian connection because it was a Canadian, Jim Mitchell, who wrote the book that is essentially your Bible that you're running, and you've really got to include that. I worked in the glory days with Ontario Hydro when we were putting in full cost accounting, and worked with them and doing the accounting for externalities under Morris Strong, and those were heady days. Now, my question, I love the vision. How do we build accountability into that vision? Right now, anything voluntary, I can tell you as an expert on accountability, anything voluntary, CSR, any of these things, there is no basis for accountability, nada. So what are we going to do about that? Voluntary is no accountability.
No, and so that's why I'm a believer in changing the accounting rules. Because once you get the accounting rules to be changed, and you do get a real price for a number of these parameters, then, let me just give you a practical example. My company TNT said that one day, well, let's go back. Your bonus is no longer for 100% based on financial results, but we want to take a far more bigger responsibility, and we're going to now do 70% is financial targets and 30% is other things, so client satisfaction, health and safety standards, and then environmental standards. I tell you, the conversation with say the 50 country managers, they basically looked at each other and said, do you understand any of that? Do you understand these measurements? No. So, okay, well, let's just go back then and we'll just drive profit and hope we win we gain the rest of that bonus also. So for the local general manager, it wasn't even voluntary. It was pushed down by the board on us, which in itself was a good idea, but it was still not good enough that we could understand it. If there were a way to get a local general manager to get in his weekly or monthly P&L to say, here's your revenue, here's your cost of doing your operations, and here's the cost of the CO2, the water, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, etc., your environmental cost, and it becomes a real cost in your P&L, I tell you, all these general managers and all these business people will just adapt to it. People say, oh, but that's too difficult for them to understand. I say, no, it's not too difficult to understand because general managers also understand how depreciation works. And depreciation is a pretty complex subject as well. And we've mastered it because that's how we that's how we drive profit. And so we have to all focus ourselves on, let's give these people the tools to understand their profit and loss statements, ideally on their normal reporting cycles. That is my personal conviction, coming from sort of the world of that reality. The weekly P&L is the holy grail. Some companies a monthly P&L. A weekly P&L is a killer, by the way. But
okay, we're at 4:30, but I've got two more people who've asked to speak.
Okay, Vincent Klassen, Policy Staff, Department of Foreign Affairs. Excellent presentation. Thank you. That connects to research we've been doing on global trends in natural resources, and we do see this increase in expectations environmentally, socially, and the impact that will have on a country like Canada that produces resources. But one aspect I'd like to ask you or better understand is how do we get this issue you mentioned of moving to tax resources rather than labor. I think that sounds logical, and what we also see is we see things like border taxes, but there are some serious obstacles to this and also to a more cooperative global approach to those things, because what we've seen in the past is that countries tend to tax externalities when those externalities originate elsewhere and overlook those externalities that they're generating themselves. So Canada feels that we're in that situation with a certain pipeline to the U.S. That's more convenient to target than U.S. coal production. In Europe, I spent a lot of time in our mission in Berlin explaining, talking about the Fuel Quality Directive, which conveniently did not affect any European interests. And when it affected Canadian oil sands, that was a small fraction of what German coal production emissions were. And meanwhile, Germany was having extraordinary difficulty reducing its subsidies for the coal industry. So I agree this is a vision that many countries, regardless of their interests, aspire to, but it runs headlong into these vested interests that I don't know who takes the first steps, and it runs headlong into an international system that's increasingly fragmented, not very cooperative, and these two recent huge trends that have given people an excuse to sort of sit back and wait. And one is the emergence of China. People say, well, why should we do this if China doesn't do it? And the other one is the financial crisis and financial fragility. And people are saying, can we afford green growth? We'll take brown growth for some time until we're sure we're on solid footing. So I just wonder how, but the core question is, how do we get to a point where those measures can be done fairly without messing things up?
Iman, can we take the next question as well, and then you can perhaps do both?
This will be really easy because I think Vincent asked my question. So it's
okay. Right. All right.
Well, one thing I think is fundamental by business coming out and making statements of being ready and being willing to move is because a lot of governments take the position that they can't change their position because business pressure them, and they say, oh, well, the private sector will never support this, and this doesn't work because the economy doesn't support it. Well, if the private sector were, and then you need a lot more than, say, a group of multinational companies, but if the private sector says, hey, there is a way out and we can achieve this, then it becomes a lot more difficult for governments to say, like, okay, well, we can't move because of the private sector. And then that's one of the things that we're really trying to get to, is that potentially huge. It's not, we're nowhere there, but these 200 companies together represent a sizable chunk of the global economy, and together they represent 25% of global emissions in the value chains that they approach. So these 200 companies, in some way or another, aligning their objectives and aligning their storylines will hopefully help in giving governments more comfort. But governments absolutely need to get to some form of conversation that is more productive than where we are today. And my personal hope is that countries that have these huge challenges like China are actually more likely to move, because the reason South Korea today, or one of the biggest reasons South Korea today is such a visionary player, is because they have such a memory of extraordinary pollution not long ago. This is only 20 years ago, it was straight in their face. And so they cleaned up their act because they kind of had to, because their population is no longer accepting it. We are exactly there in Beijing, Guangzhou. And I mean, everybody talks about Beijing, but I tell you, go to Taiyuan, it's far worse. You go to Chongqing, you can't breathe there for a day. And so I think the pressure that the Chinese government is under to deliver at their to their own population and to really put sustainable development very high. The push from the Communist Party to get Chinese companies to participate in our forum is huge. Absolutely huge. Yeah. Our conversations with SASAC are some of the most open, constructive conversations that we have with any government. That doesn't mean that we're there yet, but at least I'm more hopeful that they're gonna play. It's the G77 with a lot of a collection of smaller countries that not only see the rest of the world is against us and we are not allowed to develop. And by the way, business is always terrible. That's a real problem. We haven't really been able to find the right inroads to have that constructive debate. Joe and I were talking about that yesterday, on whether the BRICS are maybe a better inroads, etc. But there again, working with national organizations of business communities is for us there absolutely vital, because we're ultimately a small organization. We need to have kind of an aligned objective with national organizations of businesses.